Hello and welcome to my presentation. So today we are going to be talking about an inherited blood disorder called sickle cell anemia. So before we get into what sickle cell is, I do want to clarify what anemia is. Okay, so if you've taken human anatomy, you should have some brief understanding of what it is. Anemia is a disorder in which the body isn't able to produce a normal amount of your erythrocytes. Okay, so you can refer to erythrocytes as red blood cells or RBC, depending on how you want to remember it by. Now, there are many issues that come from not having the necessary amount of red blood cells in the body, primarily because the majority of the oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin, okay, in those cells, and they get transported to the systemic circuit. If you remember the systemic circuit, it's heading to visceral organs, to tissues, other cells. It's how we get oxygen to the top of our heads all the way down to our toes. Okay, so I did attach some images, so as a refresher to what we expect to see in normal histology, in normal blood samples, blood smears. So in this image here, I did attach, it's kind of a zoomed in image of, so you can see white blood cells respectively. They are purplish, very pigmented. They're really in your face, so they're not hard to miss. But they do take up only about like 1% of your blood composition. Okay, so if you were to see a spike in this amount, or like in these type of cells particularly, most likely your body's fighting off an infection. Okay, and let's refer to the middle image. I chose this image so you can see how the ratio here on red blood cells has in comparison to all the other ones. Okay, keep in mind these cells here, this is the white blood cells. I did that on purpose so it's zoomed in so you can see in comparison it's surrounded basically by these red blood cells. And then we have platelets, which is also about 1%. It's the specks here, very small. If you remember what platelets are, those are the cells that create plugs in injuries. So for example, if you cut yourself, those platelets rush to that site and they work very hard to create the scab that sometimes we just like picking off, and it scabs over again, you pick it off again, it just keeps going. But yes, they do create those scabs for you. Okay, so let's move on. Now that we know what we're looking at, what we're looking for, essentially, let's talk about the more common type of anemia, which is iron deficiency. Okay, so iron deficiency anemia, it's the same problem. It's lack of red blood cells. And if you were to compare between this image and this image, these are your red blood cells, right? They are inconsistent. They're not pigmented at all in comparison to these. Their size and shape, they're not cohesive, and there's a lack of those cells. Okay, remember, the white blood cell used to be overtaken, and it looks like in comparison now it's not that there's not that many red blood cells. This is a dramatic increase if you were to compare from this one to this one. This is the standard of a healthy individual. This is a balance ratio here. The red blood cells are supposed to take up one of the majority of the compositions of blood. So we do not want to see this if someone was taking a test, especially if you were taking a test, and you had your blood smear taken for a sample and you see that, that is not good. Okay, so of course, iron deficiency, you can fix it with the proper diet. It is, you can take iron supplements. It is not an immediate effect. It will take time, but you can progress out of this and make your situation better. Okay, so now that I've talked about what anemia is, let's move on and talk about what sickle cell anemia is. Okay, so this disease is considered rare in the States, but not worldly. And there's a reason for that, and we will talk about that further into the slides. Okay, it is the more common inherited blood disorder, though. So what is sickle cell anemia? Sickle cell anemia is described as an inherited disorder that affects the hemoglobin. Okay. The hemoglobin is the major protein that carries oxygen in the red blood cells. Okay, so anemia is the lack of the red blood cells. Sickle cell is affects the hemoglobin within the red blood cells. Okay, so a singular hemoglobin molecule is described as spherical, has 4 polypeptide chains. Okay, I attached an image so you can refer to it. So you can see here, it actually has the 4 chains. It's composed of 4 subunits, 2 alpha chains, and 2 beta chains. So as you can see here, we have 1 alpha, another alpha, so that's 2, 1 beta, and then another beta, that's 2. Okay. Each of those chains, regardless if it's alpha or beta, it has a heme group, right? It's going to be this circular structure here. Within the heme group, it's where we find the iron atom. This is the binding site, okay? Remember, hemoglobin has the binding site, and the iron atom actually attaches itself to oxygen. This is where it's able to carry oxygen in the cells, and then it gets transported. So this is one singular hemoglobin molecule, and each individual erythrocyte holds millions of these hemoglobin molecules. This is why it's important for healthy red blood cells. This is why we need them. This is a mother load of oxygen being sent to travel throughout your entire body. Okay, so now that we know where it is molecularly, down to as helpful through the image, right? So you can see now where it is. Let's move on and talk about what changes are happening in this portion of the molecular structure. Okay, is we know what red blood cells look like, what they should look like. They are disc-shaped cells, very flexible. They can move through vessels effectively. Okay, sickle cells are not normal shaped cells. They are misshaped, and they have this crescent shape. It's kind of like a waxing moon, if you know what that looks like. It's kind of has a shape of a banana. It's curved. This happens due to a gene mutation, hence the inherited disorder. The disorder happens with the mutation in the DNA gene sequence of the beta globin. Okay, remember I said that it's composed of alpha and beta, 2 alpha, 2 beta. The mutation occurs in the beta. Okay, this specific type of mutation that we're talking about is called a point mutation. It's it either includes insertion, deletion, or simple change. Well, I guess I wouldn't call it simple, but it is a change. So I actually have prepared the amino acid sequence for normal hemoglobin, right? This is the legit sequence for hemoglobin in a healthy individual, right? And then right below, we have the mutated hemoglobin sequence. So we're going to talk about the change and what it means. Okay, so as you can see here, we know that these are nucleotide bases, right? Or we're assuming that we know a little bit about chemistry. So in the normal hemoglobin sequence, the codons, they signal proline, glutamic acid, and then glutamic acid, right? Each nucleotide base creates a codon, and then we can see here that, right, you can see it either encodes a specific amino acid or a stop signal. So we got proline, glutamic acid, and glutamic acid. This is normal hemoglobin, okay? Now, if we go down to the mutated, I highlighted the portion in which the change happens, okay? It's actually going to be in the first glutamic acid, what's supposed to be the glutamic acid. So as we can see here, there is no insertion. There is no deletion of, or no deleting of a nucleotide base. So the only thing we have left is a change in the nucleotide base, which we can see here. As we can see, the swap occurs with adenine and thymine. This leads to structural changes, okay? I previously mentioned that the original hemoglobin molecule is composed of a 4 polypeptide chain. Well, this swap leads to a structural change of a longer chain and a continuous amino acid sequence. If we refer back to chemistry, we know these sequences have start and stop codons, right? Well, because of the switch between thymine and adenine, the first glutamic acid actually changes to valine, and it interrupts the original sequence. So someone with this disease, sickle cell, they have abnormal molecules, and this change starts all the way down to the molecular composition. This new hemoglobin is referred to as hemoglobin S. Let's see if I can write down. So hemoglobin S, it's referred to as SS, while having the normal hemoglobin is referred to as A and A. This is normal. Okay, let's move on. So briefly mentioned with sickle cell anemia. So what is the trait, right? So you might be wondering, what are the downsides to sickle cell? Having sickle cell can actually be painful. People who suffer from the disease, they are susceptible to pain crises, which can last from hours to days. There we go. It lasts hours to days to weeks. Okay, so what's causing the pain? So you can refer to the bottom portion of this image. So you can see where the blood flow and which way it's happening in the artery. We can see sickle cells are clotting. Now, if you can remember, I did say erythrocytes, normal ones at least, they can bend. They're very flexible. They have the ability to conform to these blood vessels. And the reason why this disorder is painful is because the sickle cells block blood flow due to their lack of ability to bend. The hemoglobin sequence being changed actually makes these cells stiff and rigid. They don't have the normal ability to move. So blood clots, they're described to feel like a localized bruise. So you might expect swelling, darkening on the skin, throbbing, and even warmth on the surface of your skin, kind of like a sunburn. People with sickle cell disease, they're at a greater risk than the normal population to suffer from blood clots, obviously, as we can see here. Now, here's why blood clots should be taken seriously. Anywhere else in the body can break, clots anywhere else in the body can break free and they can travel. So if a clot travels and creates blockages, let's say in the lungs, this can lead to a pulmonary embolism. Usually these clots come from a vein in the leg, but what happens is it creates an issue with blood flow and oxygen levels in your lungs, which affects the rest of your body. And notice how we came full circle. Everything I mentioned so far about this disease somehow affects the oxygen levels in the body, whether that be from the lack of healthy blood cells, because keep in mind, a healthy red blood cell, it lives up to 120 days, assuming we have a really good diet and we take care of ourselves. A sickled cell lasts only 10 to 20 days. If you were paying attention, you'll remember that I mentioned that red blood cells are the mother lode for oxygen. So if you're losing more cells than they are being replaced, especially red blood cells, you'll end up with anemia. Okay, so I think I put this slide first on accident. It was supposed to be after. But regardless, let's move on. What is sickle cell anemia? And what is the trait? Okay, so someone with a sickle cell trait, they are carriers. They only have a single recessive gene for sickle cell disease. Okay, while the individual with the disease, they carry both. So as you can see here, let me refer back to my pen. I briefly wrote on the other slide that sickle cell anemia, the hemoglobin, S, is referred to as SS. This is for the disease. But if we're talking about the trait, we're talking about AS. They only have one recessive gene. That's why there's only one S. And then remember, normal is AA. They don't have it at all. Okay, so people who only possess the trait, they're carriers, and they can enjoy their life without having medical problems in regarding to sickle cell. The sickle cell trait, it will never progress into the disease. But because they are carriers, if they were to, have offspring, have children in the future, they could pass it on to their children. And remember, this disease is inherited. So the chances of the disease becoming present in children will increase if the individual that you're choosing as your partner has a trait or is also suffering from the disease. Okay, so humor me for a second so that we can do this quick exercise, assuming that we know how to do Punnett squares, so that we can see what the chances are of having a child either be a carrier or someone suffering with the disease. Okay. Move my camera. That was not a good choice. Okay. So I do have what the genotype possibilities are. So hemoglobin, normal, AA. Sickle cell trait, AS, remember, one recessive gene. Sickle cell disease, both recessive genes, okay? This is the full-blown disease. So hypothetically, these two couples, they want to have kids. So what are the chances of their children either being a carrier or suffering from the disease? These are just possibilities, okay? So in the first square, okay, so in the first square, we do have, that's one normal possibility, that's 25%. We move on to the next square. This is also another 25%. We're at 50% possibility chance normal. If you have one normal parent and you have one carrier parent. Okay, now we're at 25% chance of them being a carrier. And that makes it 50-50 chance. If this couple A, has children. Let's see if I can write 50, 50. Okay, move back to my camera. All right, now let's move on to couple B. This one is a bit different. We have one carrier parent and we have one parent with the disease. So what happens? What will the genetic makeup percentage be if they were to have kids? So very quickly. Okay, so that's 25% chance of them being a carrier. 25% chance of them having the disease. Now we're at 50% carrier. 50% chance. This is another 50-50 situation, but the difference is they don't have a single possibility of their child becoming or having normal hemoglobin. Regardless, they're going to have some sort of sickle cell in there, whether that be the trait or the disease. Okay, that's supposed to be 50-50, by the way. So yeah, let's look at these results for a second. Hey, it's not looking too good for couple B, but yeah, couple A, they only risk having children with carrier traits, carrier genes. Couple B, on the other hand, it's gonna be a little rough, and this is why sometimes it's recommended to have testing done prior to having children, especially if you're aware that there's a disorder that runs in the family, because remember, this is a genetic disorder, it's inherited. You want to do that if you're aware that there's a disorder, illness, or disease that runs in the family. And I want to know, and you might think like, hey, I want to know what the odds are of my child developing this said disease or disorder. And being informed of your situation is never a bad thing. Okay, so let's move on to treatment options. Okay. So our first treatment option is hydroxyurea. It can be administered through the mouth in tablet form with water once a day. As a result, a patient with type SS, so sickle cell disease, they can expect less hospital visits, fewer pain crises, and the slowing of the damage to your organs. So, this particular the medication, it increases hemoglobin F, and it's helpful to sickle cell patients because of its inhibitory properties. It doesn't allow sickle cells to become to form when you administer this medication. It works by increasing the hemoglobin F, and it's found in abundance in newborn babies. The more hemoglobin F that is present in patients with this disease, it will be less likely for their blood cells to be problematic. So a fun fact about hydroxyurea, it's used to treat certain types of cancer, but for sickle cell disease, it's administered in lower doses. And let's move on to crizanlizumab. This is administered through intravenous. It's given through the IV line in the vein once a month and helps prevent blood cells from sticking to the blood. Okay, so we know that the sickle cells, when they become rigid or and stiff, they actually also become sticky, and that's the reason for the blood clots and the clumping of the cells. So this medication actually helps prevent that, and also prevents pain crises and lowers the possibility of clotting, as I just mentioned. Okay, so now we have blood and bone marrow transplant. For this treatment to work, you first need a well-matched donor, which is usually a close blood relative. To begin this process, a provider collects the stem cells from the donor's blood, and they then infuse it into the donor cells. They then infuse the donor cells into the recipient's blood. The cells are carefully placed into the marrow regions of the bone, where the cells will produce healthy red blood cells that form normal hemoglobin. Okay, so now let's move into the complication of blood and bone marrow transplant. So the downside is the recipient can contract graft versus host disease. And when this happens, the new donor cells attack the body of the recipient. So the risk of infection here is very high. Okay. So we just talked about all the negatives of this disease. So are there any benefits from having sickle cell? Well, in certain regions and specific demographics, yes, sickle cell disease can be beneficial and can be viewed through Darwinism. Okay, and what I mean by Darwinism is the aspect in which natural selection occurs. So, for example, let's refer to this image here. If there is, a brown and white rabbit population, obviously these are black rabbits, but let's say for the sake of the example, brown and white rabbits. Which of the two would have an edge or advantage in a snowy setting, the brown or the white? Well, the white rabbit, because of its coat and its ability to camouflage to its surroundings. This would lead to a decline in the brown population, the brown rabbit population, and an increase in the white rabbit population. This is natural selection, okay? These white rabbits can hide from predators in the way that brown rabbits can. They get picked off, and then we're left with the white coat. They will move on into the newer generations, and then we'll see a rise of white coats. Do you see where I'm going with? Okay, so let's tie this back to sickle cell in case you don't see where I'm going with this. I mentioned this fact at the beginning of the presentation. Sickle cell disease is not common in the States. In fact, it's rare, but it's prevalent in other countries, such as Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania. As you can see, it's just the midsection of Africa. And there's a reason for that, and the reason is malaria. So what is malaria? Well, malaria is a disease caused by the Plasmodium parasite. It's transmitted by the bite of infected mosquitoes. Okay, so let's talk about, I kind of want to organize this in a way where I want to talk about how it affects normal hemoglobin, how it affects the sickle cell, someone with the sickle cell trait, and how it affects someone with full-on disease. Okay, so in normal hemoglobin, the infected saliva of the mosquito carries the malaria parasite, where it rides the bloodstream towards the liver. Okay, the Kupffer cells, Kupffer, I think that's how you pronounce it. which I mentioned, it forms the lining of the liver, right? It's this is the entryway. This is how parasites get inside. So once they find their way to the specific Kupffer cells, right? Because that's what they're looking for. Over the next few days, the parasite will reproduce in the liver. The next generation of parasite cells, they have a new target. It's not the liver. They're only there to like reproduce, and then they do kill off. They damage a couple cells in the liver, but that's not their target. So the newer generations, while they're being produced in the liver, they have to re-enter the bloodstream, where they will head for the red blood cells. So they have to head back into the pathway they originally came. So these new parasitic cells, they have the ability to hide from the body's immune system when it enters the red blood cell. Once it enters the red blood cell, it will devour all of the contents inside the red blood cell. So we know hemoglobin molecules, and there's several of those, and there's a lot of oxygen in there. So the invaded cell, it will become sticky. It will stick to the vessel walls, and it will burst. And they actually reproduce again inside the red blood cells. So when it bursts, it releases more parasites, and they will do the same thing with other neighboring red blood cells in the pathway, right? In the vessels that they're traveling in. They will attach themselves to more red blood cells. They will get sticky. They'll eat everything inside. They'll reproduce. And once they get sticky, they start clotting onto the blood vessel walls. Then they'll burst. And then it'll keep happening. It's a cycle. So individuals with normal red blood cells, they don't have a natural immunity for malaria. And so they will suffer blood loss from the bursting of those red blood cells. They will have fever, brain damage, and in severe cases, they can fall into a coma. So let's move on to sickle cell trait. Remember, sickle cell trait contains only one recessive gene and one normal gene. People with the trait are not as affected by malaria in comparison to those with normal hemoglobin. People with this trait, they also get rid of their parasites faster. We understand that these parasites will eventually find their way to red blood cells. But these red blood cells are already misshapen. Can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but sickle cell trait has a mix of both normal erythrocytes and sickled erythrocytes. So it's a blend of both. While sickle cell disease is just sickle cells. Okay, so we understand that they'll find their way to the red blood cells. But when they get there, there's a blend of misshapen red blood cells, right? So it affects the parasite's ability to complete the cycle. The sickle cells only last up to 10 to 20 days. And on top of that, they're very fragile. So when they try to penetrate the red cells to progress the cycle, they burst them in contact. So because they're not able to hide within the red blood cells, right? Because I did mention primarily in normal hemoglobin, they use red blood cells not only to travel and reproduce, but to hide from the immune system. Remember, I said that our immune system cells, it involves the white blood cells. Okay, so the white blood cells are on the hunt here. They don't see anything because, well, the red blood cells are hiding them. But if these parasites can never enter the red blood cells, and they're in the bloodstream, which is where we find white blood cells, they're not able to reproduce. The immune system will eventually clear the infected red blood cells and prevent the spread to other cells. So let's move on to the disease. So you would think having both recessive genes provides protection, but it does not. It's actually been studied that those with sickle cell anemia have the lowest chances of survival, while those with the trait have the highest. And this is because malaria can trigger a sickle cell crisis. Remember, a crisis is the clotting. As I mentioned when I was describing the timeline of a host with normal hemoglobin, the infected cells stick to the blood vessel wall. Now, keep in mind, people with the disease, they only have sickled cells. They don't have any normal ones. So what happens when parasites try to attach themselves? Well, they'll burst immediately. And so what happens when you have a constant amount of red blood cells bursting, we do have a loss of cells. They already don't last very long, right? They only last 10 to 20 days, while the normal ones last up to 120 with a good diet. And then we have parasites coming in trying to achieve a cycle in these fragile red blood cells. They're going to immediately burst them. And when we're losing a bunch of cells left and right, especially the ones that carry oxygen, we're going to end up with anemia. And on top of that, it's a blood loss. Okay, so to highlight some of the main points in this section, the reason for sickle cell in these areas, right, in these African countries, and it's not just Africa. There are some portions of India and some neighboring islands. But the reason for sickle cell in these areas is to gain a genetic advantage against malaria, and it is very likely that someone of African descent is a carrier for sickle cell or has the disease. And remember I said African descent, not necessarily just in Africa. It could be someone who lives in the United States and they actually have a higher chance of having sickle cell disease or being a carrier for that trait, even if they don't live in these areas where I listed that malaria is at its highest. Because we know that in the States, we don't suffer from an epidemic of malaria. We might suffer from other things like COVID, but we don't have a genetic advantage. Like, let's say me, if I were to have sickle cell and live in the United States, what do I benefit from it? I don't have any benefits at all. I'm not going to go outside and get infected by an infected mosquito. It's just not going to happen. The malaria rate here is almost non-existent in comparison to other countries. So this is really the only genetic advantage, unfortunately, to combat malaria and just in general for having the disease or the trait in particular. You would no longer have a genetic edge if you didn't live in these regions, but had sickle cell or the trait. So that is all the information that I have for this disease. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Hopefully my information did come across. And you have a great day, and until next time.